Hi everyone, I'm Matt Hunt and welcome back for the second part of our video series guiding you through how to get the most out of the Octopi Poker Postflop library. If you're new to working with solvers and you haven't yet watched our first how-to video, I recommend you go back and check that one out before you watch this one. This video is going to be geared towards people who have some familiarity with how solvers work, either because they've already watched our first video or already used Octopi, or because they've already used other solvers and they're familiar with the basic functionality and they just want to get used to how Octopi differs from some of the other solvers they've used in the past. We're going to go through the advanced functionalities of the library one by one, and the first thing we're going to talk about is the aggregate reports. So first and foremost, what is an aggregate report? Well, if you're not familiar, aggregate reports are a way to get a good view of your strategy at kind of a 30,000-foot level. They can show you your strategy for different flop textures in a specific scenario or situation. They can show you the distribution of each specific bet size in the entire game tree across all 1,755 strategically unique flops. So if you want to figure out which boards are better for small bets or big bets, or how often you should be betting the flop from a certain position, you can do that using aggregate reports. Now, when I say strategically unique, I'm referring to the fact that the actual suit of the flop doesn't matter for strategic purposes. For example, if the flop is ace, king, 5 monotone, it doesn't matter if the suit is spades or hearts, clubs or diamonds. It's the same flop. The tricky part here, and a very important thing to remember, is that while the suits on monotone boards don't matter, like we mentioned, the suits on two-tone boards are very significant. For example, ace of diamonds, king of diamonds, queen of clubs, ace of diamonds, king of clubs, queen of diamonds, and ace of clubs, king of diamonds, queen of diamonds are all different flops. There's 3 different flops there, and they do require different strategies because the non-diamond card on the board is changing each time. And this is changing whether or not it's possible to have top pair plus a flush draw, middle pair plus a flush draw, bottom pair plus a flush draw. Plus, it's going to influence the equity of certain other flush draw hands. Now, we don't yet have reports added to the library for every single post-flop scenario, but we are working to add more all the time. For now, let me show you the 3 different ways of accessing these reports. First, you can go to the Analysis tab, like I'm going to do here, and you can pick a formation. In this case, I'm going to go with 60 big blinds, and we're going to scroll it back to the under the gun versus big blind formation right here, and fold everybody around to the big blind. We hit call, and then it's going to give us this aggregate reports option right here. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to take me right to the right screen. Alternatively, if you're already in the process of reviewing a specific situation, like I am here, you can just go down to the bottom left of the screen, and there's this aggregate reports button that you can click on, and it takes you back again to the same place. And then finally, if you're already looking at a sim and you go up here to the Edit Spot button, you'll then see the Aggregate Reports option pop up here in the bottom right. So there are 3 different places from which you can access the Aggregate Reports screen, which is nice and easy. Now let's talk a little bit about what you're going to see once you actually load up the report here. You want to think of it a little bit like looking at 1,755 different flop sims all at once. You're always going to be loading the same node of the tree across all the flops. And you can see the tree here on the left-hand side so that you know which node is active at any given moment. When you first open a report, you'll see that the initial node on the flop is going to be the default node that's selected. So let's take a look at this one right here. In this formation, the under the gun 8 versus big blind, this represents the big blind's decision to either check or bet 25% of pot on the flop. They also have the all-in option, but they're never using that on any flop. If we want to see what frequency each option is used across all flops, we can see right here that these bars under rainbow flops, two-tone flops, and monotone flops are giving us an idea of how frequently we're taking each action, depending on what the broad flop texture is like. And this is a nice spot to use as our example for now because it allows us to ask ourselves a pretty simple question that we can answer using aggregate reports. On which board textures does the big blind want to have a donk betting range? Now, there are a few ways we can go about answering this question, but I'm going to show you the simplest one right here. You can see the 3 columns taking up the bulk of the screen. You can ignore the options at the top up here, and I'll show you those in a little bit. These columns, as we see, represent rainbow, two-tone, and monotone flops. And the boards are sorted in high card order by default, but we can change that as I'll show you in a moment. If we want to figure out on which boards the big blind is using the B25 donk bet size at the highest frequencies, we can simply click on the B25 option here at the top of each column to sort these boards by order of big blind B25 frequency. We can sort them by highest to lowest, or if I click them a second time, it will sort from lowest to highest, as you can see right there. We could also do the inverse if we wanted, and we could double click the checking frequency to get a sense of the overall lowest frequency checking flops, which I do right here. Second click on each one. And as you can see, it gives us the same result. And this is useful if you're looking at a spot with more than one bet sizing option being used. You can just sort for the lowest checking frequency instead of the highest betting frequency. Right away, we can see a couple of fairly obvious trends here in the results. First of all, there's almost no donk betting on monotone flop textures here, except for a very small amount on some of these ace-high monotone flops, where perhaps the under the gun raiser is less likely to have a flush because the suited ace hands can't make a flush anymore. In the other two columns, though, we can see that there are some very particular and specific types of boards where the big blind has an incentive to donk bet at a higher frequency. The most obvious of which is this 6-5-4, either rainbow or two-tone in a few different variations. If we wanted to examine why this is the case, we can just click on the flop here and it'll take us right to the sim featuring that board texture. And it'll open it up in the usual strategy dashboard. So you can see right here, this is the sim, and we can navigate it in the same way that we would normally. If I go back to the reports, another useful thing that we can do is actually sort the boards in terms of their EV for each player. If I hit the EV button right here, it's going to sort the flops in order of their EV for the big blind. So what we can do here is we can compare some of these boards to the average for that category of board in this scenario to get a sense of how good or bad these boards are for us in general. So for example here, the average EV for all the rainbow boards in this situation for the big blind is 1.76 big blinds, and that 6-5-4 has an EV of 3.25 big blinds. So clearly that's way better than average for the big blind. So that's the most basic way of using aggregate reports when we just have a binary set of options between bet and check. And we can see which boards are the ones we want to bet most often. But to get a little bit more advanced with it, we can click through to the in-position players options here, which in this case is, of course, the under the gun 8 player, and see a little bit more detail. And to do that, we're going to take a look at the use of different bet sizings. If I want to, for example, figure out which flops are the ones where the in-position player wants to use the larger bet sizings more often, I can simply click on those sizings up here. In this case, I'm going to go with this B125 size, which is a big overbet size here. And we're going to look at that on all three textures. Now, immediately, it's pretty obvious here that we should never do this on a monotone flop because that size is never used at all on monotone flops. So we actually don't need to worry about those at all here. And we're going to minimize this section of the report. So I'm just going to hit the name monotone flops. And as you can see, it's now showing us only 2 columns instead of all 3. This is a nice way to just ignore one category of boards if you've already figured out that a certain bet size or a certain strategy just isn't happening at all on these boards. Now we can see a few potential trends here just by scanning the boards in the columns here, but we're going to get a bit more specific with it. To do that, we can use these options at the top up here. We have the option to filter either by the pairing of the board with pair, trips, or nothing, or the connectivity of the board with 3 to a straight, open-ended straight draw, or disconnected, and of course by the high card on the board as well. Now note that boards with one or more gut shots on them like Jack 7-3 or Queen 8-4 are considered disconnected because they don't allow for an open-ended straight draw. While on the open-ender or straight boards, these hands don't actually have to be in either player's range, they just have to be theoretically possible. So for example, 10-6-4 counts as an open-ender board even if neither player could realistically have 7-5 or 5-3 in a given situation. Now there are also 2 filter options here. You can see that there's high card filter and there's also filter flop. Now each of these does a slightly different thing, so I want to explain these in some detail here. The filter flop option on the left here filters for flops that include any combination of certain cards. For example, if I put a 9 and a 7 in here as the first two cards, it's going to then give me any flop that includes a 9 or a 7. So you've got boards like Queen 9-7, King 9-7, Ace 9-7 featuring in this list. Now I'm going to reset. I'm going to use the one on the right here, high card filter, and I'm going to do the same thing, and you'll see that it gives me a different result. This is because the high card filter is only giving us boards that are specifically a 9 as the highest card and a 7 as the middle card. So all those King 9-7, Ace 9-7, etc. are no longer appearing here. There are also sub-filters on each of the columns here, and these function the same way as the filter flop option on the top left. So if I put the 9 and the 7 in the rainbow boards category in the filter here, you'll see that it gives me Queen 9-7, King 9-7, Ace 9-7, etc. in the results. If we want to reset the filters, we just click this button up here, as you've already seen me do. Now note that this refresh button doesn't just apply to the high card filter, even though it's right next to it. It actually applies to all the filters. So be careful about that. If you want to reset just the high card filter, you have to open the high card filter and then hit this reset button. It's a different button. We're going to work on making that clearer for you guys. So if our goal here was to try to figure out which flops were better for the under the gun 8 player to use the overbet size, then we would just look at the trends in these board textures and try to figure it out. Right now we're at a 17% overbet frequency on the rainbow boards and only 6% on the two-tone boards. So that gives us a clear indication that the rainbow boards are more favorable for this size, first of all. Now that might seem a little counterintuitive, but there are a few reasons why that's the case, and it would take a whole different video to explain it, so we're not going to go too deep into the strategy just here. For now, let's just tweak some of the filters and see how it alters the under the gun 8 player's willingness to overbet. If we make the flop either a paired or a trips flop, so we just highlight these two categories right here, now the overbetting completely disappears. So immediately we can be quite confident that we should never overbet on a paired or a trips flop, which is a nice simplification similar to how we're never doing it on a monotone flop. Good starting point for us right there. Let's now filter for unpaired flops. So we'll just go back right here and let's test the impact of connectivity. If we select the boards with 3-2 a straight, we can see that there's pretty minimal levels of overbetting. In fact, there's only a few boards, very specifically these really low card boards and a little bit of 10-7-6 and 9-8-5 that are actually featuring much overbetting. So other than this 6-5 deuce rainbow, which is a bit of an outlier here, there really isn't a lot of overbetting going on. And I would suspect that the reason for this is because the big blind never has 6 deuce or 5 deuce offsuit in range. But that's a small thing. So we know from this that we can mostly forego overbetting on boards that have 3-2 a straight as well. What about open-ended boards? Let's get rid of the 3-2 a straight and just look at the open-ended ones. Immediately, it's very clear that open-ended boards are really good for these overbets because look at how much of this is happening here. And open-ended boards specifically that are not monotone, these are really good for big bets. That's a very good learning point for us right there. And if we look at the disconnected boards, we're now going to see that there is going to be some overbetting on these boards, but it's not quite as much. In fact, especially on the disconnected two-tone boards, it's going to go down quite a bit. So overall here, the best case scenario for these overbets is going to start out by being the unpaired, open-ended straight draw boards. That's a really nice thing for us to know and a really nice category for us to filter down to here. We can also go further and we can add another filter here for the high card. If we filter for ace high, then we can see immediately very, very little overbetting here. So even when we specifically isolate the unpaired open-ended straight draw boards, we can now also take out the ace high boards. If we go for some king high boards, that starts to see a lot more. But again, the two-tone is not as much as the rainbow. If we go with the queen high boards, well, now we're really seeing a lot more. And the jack high boards are a huge frequency of overbets. In fact, a lot of these jack high boards are range bets where we quite frequently will use the overbet size with a big portion of our range and then bet a smaller size with the rest of it. So these boards are really, really good for these overbets. So from all this analysis, we can build a bit of a heuristic for ourselves here. The overbet size is going to be really good on a lot of these jack high boards preferably rainbow with an open ender, not 3 to a straight, not monotone, not paired, not trips. It's really specifically going to be jack high, maybe also some 10 high. If we scan through the 10 high boards here, we'll see a similar thing right there, as you can see. So specifically those types of boards with an open ender, these are really good big bet boards here in this formation. Nice heuristic for us. Our next concern here would be to identify how we're actually constructing our range in situations where we're using this big bet size. And for that, we would need to look at a specific sim. So let's do that and pick out a spot where we're overbetting quite a lot here. This is also going to serve as an explanation of our next tool, which is the side-by-side ranges function. Now let's explore the side-by-side ranges function. I've picked a board from the aggregate report that we just looked at, which is this Queen 8-6 rainbow board. And I've picked it because it's one where the in-position player is using each of the 3 bet sizes at roughly equal frequencies. And the usage of different sizes is going to help me to show you how the side-by-side view works. Now we're at the big blind action node here, and as you can see, the big blind is checking their entire range. But let's now click the side-by-side view down in the bottom left corner. Now you can see the view has changed, and it says no previous node exists here on the right-hand side. Well, that's because, somewhat obviously, this is where the other strategy is going to pop up in order to enable it to be side-by-side. Now you can see it says current to act and previous action at the top. Make sure you keep your eye on those when you're using this view, because if you jump back and forward between different actions, it can get a bit confusing. So just make sure you're not accidentally looking at the wrong node. And remember that current to act is always representing whatever node is highlighted by this white box over on the left-hand side, around the game tree view over here. You can see that within this side-by-side view, we have a condensed version of the main strategy dashboard. We have the hand classes and the range map in the same way that we do in the main dashboard. And we also have the grid showing the strategy itself, plus the bars now showing the overall strategy, which are now vertical instead of horizontal. Everything works the same way here as it does in the main view, so there's no need for me to go through all of it again and explain it again to you. The real magic happens when I actually click on the big blind's checking action right here and navigate to the next node of the tree. You can see the under the gun 8 players strategy appear right here on the right-hand side. Now again, everything works the same way as it did before, except you get to see both strategies at once here. And we have one extremely useful feature in this view that you'll get a lot out of. If I hover over one of the bet sizes in the under the gun 8 players strategy here, you can see that the view on the left is going to change. And this is giving me a sense of the big blind strategy against this bet size. You can see it says next to act now. So we've got all the frequencies there. Now, if I change the size that I'm hovering over, it's going to load the response to that specific size instead. And again, I can do the same thing. Load the node for 25% here. And if I was to go back and forth between them after they've been loaded, of course, I can now view them at a glance a lot more easily and see how the big blind's response against each bet size is going to differ. If I want to continue looking at one response in detail, I can click on one of the bet sizes and it will retain the selection over here on the left so that I can mouse over anything that I want if the big blind is facing this B125 option. If I unselect that, then we're going to go back to the main view where hovering over any size is going to show me the response. That's really useful. Now, if I was to hover over check, you can see it's going to say end of line on the left, and that's because this node leads to us going to the turn here. But nevertheless, there's plenty you can do when going between streets, because if you plug in what the turn card actually is, you can see the in-position player's flop strategy and the out-of-position player's turn strategy at the same time, as long as you specify the turn card. So that's really important as well and really useful. For example, I'm going to proceed through the node here where the in-position player uses the B75 size, and we're going to see what the big blind's response looks like. This is it right here on the left. Now, if the big blind calls the flop bet and the turn is going to be the 8 of spades, we'll select that right there. We can now actually see the big blind's flop check call range on the left right here with the selected action. And we can also see the next action on the turn, which is the out of position strategy on this specific turn card. So you can immediately see not only what the big blind is check calling the flop with, but also what they're doing on the turn. And this turn is obviously so good for their range that they are donking basically everything. They have an 8 at such a high frequency here. So this view is really, really good, particularly for these out of position nodes where maybe we want to study what we're going to be donk betting on the next street, or if the flop goes check, check, what are we going to be doing on the turn, etc. It's a really good view that gives us a sense of how our strategy across two streets can connect. And of course, how one player's strategy can connect with the response to that strategy. To show you a little bit what that looks like, we're going to quickly edit the spot here, and we're going to look at a different flop. We're going to look at 9-8-5 with 2 diamonds. We're going to hit review sim. And in this situation, we're going to have the in position player check back the flop, which, as you'll see, is going to happen with quite a bit of their range. We're going to have big blind check once it loads up. And then, as you see, we've got about 54 to 46% here. So there's a lot of checking back from in position. And if we then put up, let's say, a deuce of spades turn, we can now see how the big blind's turn strategy is going to connect to the under the gun 8 flop check back range right here. The big blind strategy pops up on the left, and this is the flop strategy. So you can get a sense of if the under the gun 8 player is checking back these hands, then that's why the big blind does XYZ on the turn. And you can really start to understand how strategies connect to each other over multiple streets in this way. So it's a really useful function right there. So now that we've seen how the side-by-side view works, let's go back to the normal strategy view, which you can see right here. And I'm going to show you some of these functions on the right-hand side, starting with the blockers and more tab. So first, we're going to talk about this option on the left-hand side of the blockers and more tab here. This tab is probably going to be more useful to you on the river than on the earlier streets. So we're going to take this 9-8-5 2 diamonds board that we saw before, and we're going to navigate all the way to the river, as you see here, in the line where the in-position player goes B75, B75 turn, and then we have a nice clean, polarized, all-in or check strategy on the river here on this deuce run-out. The blockers box essentially just shows us what a player's strategy would look like if we remove 1 or 2 cards from the deck, which in most cases would be because we know those are the cards in our hand. You could also use it if a card is exposed pre-flop in a live hand, for example. The primary purpose of doing this is to be able to figure out whether certain cards are good or bad blockers. In other words, do they increase or decrease the frequency at which our opponent takes certain actions? For example, if I'm looking at this spot here from the U8 player's perspective, and I want to try to figure out if it's a good spot to bluff with a missed diamond draw, I can navigate to the spot where the big blind is facing a river jam, and I can see how adding diamonds to the blockers box, so for example, the ace and the king of diamonds, and then enabling the blockers box right here with this little checkbox, actually affects our opponent's frequencies. We're essentially saying that these are our whole cards now. And as you can see, the big blind's folding frequency has actually gone slightly down. We have the original range right here, the overall range, which is folding 57% of the time, and the sub range is folding 55%. So this is basically the range that does not include any ace or king of diamonds hands. So clearly having the ace or king of diamonds, not an ideal thing for us in this situation, because if we're going to bluff, we don't want our opponent to fold less often. We want them to fold more often. So that's a really interesting thing for us to observe right away. In addition, we can also look at the EV of the sub range we've just created. I've switched from the equity view back to the EV view here. And as you can see, the EV has now gone up from 7.7 overall to 8.1 with the sub range. So that means that removing the ace or the king of diamonds, or both cards in this case, from the big blind's range is actually increasing their EV, which kind of makes sense because you're removing some of the missed flush draws. You can also see the same thing in more detail down here by looking at the full range EV and then blocked range EV. Basically just get another decimal place down here. By contrast, if we looked at, let's say, a hand like the Jack 10 of spades, and we look at the blocker effects there, the sub range has still gone slightly up in EV. We've gone from 7.7 to 8. But the folding frequency has gone from 57 to 58. So even though they're increasing their EV, that's just a product of we're removing a bad hand from their range. The removal of these two cards is actually improving our ability to successfully bluff this river, whereas removing the ace and king of diamonds did the opposite. Two final things to note here about the blockers tab. Firstly, it works on an or basis, not an and basis, which means that when you put the jack 10 of spades in this box, it's removing those two cards from the deck, which means it removes any hand that contains either one of those two cards, not just the hands that contain both of them. So we're not just removing those two specific cards as a hand combination, we're removing everything that contains either one of them, because that's how blockers work in real life. If we have the jack 10 of spades, our opponent can never have any hand that includes the jack of spades or the 10 of spades. And secondly, the blockers tab doesn't pay any attention to whether or not those cards are actually in the player's ranges at this point. For example, if I select the 3 of clubs and the 3 of spades here, it's going to have almost no impact. You can see the frequencies have stayed the same, the subrange EV has stayed the same, because neither player, neither us nor our opponent, ever has a hand here that contains the 3 of clubs or the 3 of spades. So in simple terms, removing those two cards from the deck would have no impact whatsoever. So that's the blockers tab. Now let's move on to the next one, which is this card matching tab. Now you can look at this card matching tab as being essentially the exact inverse of the blockers tab. It will show you only hands which contain the card or cards that you've highlighted. So if I want to figure out the significance of, say, the ace of diamonds in this spot, I can select it right here, and I can check out how often the big blind is calling here with hands that contain the ace of diamonds, which of course is not very often because most of those hands are pretty weak now. I can also do the same thing from the U8 perspective here, and I can see from that how likely it is that we're going to bluff the river or bet the river with hands that contain certain specific cards. And as you can see here, the ace of diamonds is a card that makes us a lot less willing to bluff the river, because you can see that frequency has gone down. And in fact, the only hands that are really betting the river here, other than specifically ace jack of diamonds, which likes to bluff, we've really got mostly just ace 9 of diamonds and pocket aces with the ace of diamonds, which are just value hands. There's only a small frequency of other stuff in there. And of course, if we add the king of diamonds into that box as well, we can see a pretty similar thing. King jack of diamonds being one of the few hands that might consider bluffing here with diamonds in them. King jack offsuit actually being quite good as well. So the jack of diamonds would seem to be a fairly important card there. But let's test that out. Let's actually switch from the ace and king of diamonds to the queen and the jack. And now you can see a few interesting things. In fact, we have a pretty clear perspective here on which hands are value betting and which hands are bluffing, because it's quite obvious the frequencies are either really high or really low. And we can see a really nice trend right here. These two cards are a big part of our bluffing range on the river, and they're a big part of our value range as well, given that pocket queens and pocket jacks are right in there, as you can see. You'll notice trends like this quite often, that our value range and our bluff range will come from similar portions of the deck. And this is so that when our opponent has a bluff catcher that blocks our value range, such as having, say, queen 9 suited here, they also now have a hand that blocks our bluffs, which means it's a little bit harder for them to effectively bluff catch with those hands that block some value. Nice little concept to use there. We can also use the card matching function to examine how some strategies are constructed on earlier streets. If we scroll back to the turn here, where the under the gun 8 player is facing a check from the big blind, we can highlight the same hand once again, and we can see now that there's a fairly clear tendency to want to use the overbet size with the offsuit hands that contain these cards, the queen jack, king jack, ace queen off. And then the suited hands that contain these cards, the ones that have the flush draw, those are much preferring the B75 size here. So that's quite an important conclusion for us to draw as well, and it's going to affect our river strategies in both of these lines on top of that. Finally, we can explore the use of specific cards that give gut shots or open-enders on boards like this. I think this is a really useful thing to be able to do. So if we highlight, for example, the 7 of clubs and 7 of spades, this is not filtering for pocket 7s. It's filtering for any hand that includes either of these two black 7s. So as you can see, a hand like black 8-7 suited is actually a high frequency bluff or kind of a merging hand here for the overbet size, while a hand like black 7-6 suited for the flop straight actually prefers to value bet for the medium size. There are all kinds of things you can do with these tools in these spots, so I would encourage you to play around with it and see what you can find out. If you want to remove the cards from this card matching box altogether so that you can select a single card instead of two cards, you can just go to recent spots. And if you then review the spot that you just looked at, it's going to reload the spot. And of course, the card matching is now going to be blanked out. So it's nice and easy right there. We're working on adding a new function that's going to make that a bit easier even further. Next, let's move on to the final part of the blockers and more tab, which is this box that says low EV mixes. Now, this tab is one of my favorite functions in Octopi's post-flop viewer because it gives you really direct insight into two specific things. Firstly, it allows you to see where the thresholds are of which hands we're folding and which hands we're close to continuing with in certain spots. But in particular, when you're facing a bet, it's also going to show you the hands that are indifferent. So the hands that are specifically 0 EV, and in some cases will be mixing multiple different options. And it's really good for understanding the specifics of a strategy and why it looks a certain way based on that. This is a vital part of optimal poker strategy because the entire game hinges on all players trying to keep each other indifferent between options as often as possible. So understanding indifference points can make a massive impact on your overall ability to construct good strategies. Now you're going to see the option in the box here to set a specific EV threshold. This option isn't enabled yet. It's not fully operational, and we're going to put that in place as soon as we can make sure that it works really smoothly. So it's going to be grayed out for the time being. But the EV is set at 0 by default because that allows us to see which hands have an EV of 0 at equilibrium. Note that if you use this tab when you're not actually facing a bet, so if I enable it right there, you're not going to see any hands highlighted because there's no hand that is a low EV, 0 EV mix. It's not indifferent between options in a 0 EV sense. So even if it might be mixing between checks and bets, for example, not 0 EV, so it's not going to show up in this box. Right now, we're mostly just looking at hands that are 0 EV when actually facing a bet. So that's where this box is going to be useful. Now, if we focus on the line where the U8 player here bets the 75% size, and then we enable the low EV mixes for the big blind, you can immediately see the range in the big blind that is indifferent versus this bet size. And quite clearly, a lot of it is an 8. So hands like 10-8, Jack-8 are in there, Ace-8 is in there, King-8 is in there a little bit. There's also stuff like 6-5, which is actually mixing all three options. If we hover over 6-5 of spades and clubs here, mixing some jams as well as some folds and some calls. So very tricky strategy with that one. And clearly part of the reason why this B75 size is used here is because it specifically makes those 9x and 8x hands here that have a jack, that have a 10, that block some bluffs. Those hands are now indifferent against this size, which is why the size is effective. If we now move through the B125 line and we do the same thing, we're going to see a different region of hands highlighted. So if I go with the same option over here, it's now the case that a lot of those hands that were previously indifferent are a lot closer to just being pure folds. And there are some hands that were not indifferent before, that were pure calls. So the queen nines, the king nines, the ace nines, that are also now indifferent against this size. Even Jack 6 of diamonds that actually has a gut shot plus a flush draw is indifferent between jamming and folding here. It's basically exactly break even though it's jamming at a high frequency. So there's a lot of hands that are indifferent against this B125 size as well. So in position here is actually going to be able to use both of these sizes because they accomplish slightly different things. And we can examine those using the low EV mix tab. Using this option to check out which hands are mixing is a great way to start to get an understanding of where your opponents are making mistakes, because the hands that are really close are the hands that they are most likely to make errors with. The mixed bluff raises, for example, are going to be the ones that they're most likely to miss. And the mixed folds and calls might be the ones that they're always calling or always folding instead of mixing. So that about does it for this tab, the blockers and more section. Let's now move on to the range graph. So the range graph is a pretty tricky thing to wrap your head around if you're not used to looking at solver outputs, but it can be a really useful tool, so it's important to understand how it works. We've jumped back to the flop here on our Queen 8-6 rainbow board, and we're going to look at the range graph for this situation and see how we can use it to break the spot down. So we can see this is the U8 players betting node here with all three sizes being used. And if we click over on the range graph, then you'll see that this is what it looks like to begin with. Now, once you click on the graph option, you're going to see the option right below that to view the pot in a few different ways. You've got big blinds, you've got percentage of pot, or you've got dollars if you're using an ICM sim. My preference is to keep it at percentage of pot because I think that helps to kind of normalize the view for each situation. And of course, bear in mind that we're using the EV view here and not the equity view. If we were going to switch to the equity view, the graph will also switch to the equity view accordingly. And you'll see some changes in how it looks on account of that, because obviously we're just dealing with a 0 to 100 scale now, instead of 0 to whatever number is the ceiling of a certain player's EV in a given spot. I'm going to switch back to EV though, because I think this is one of the better ways to look at this scenario. For now, we're just going to focus on the two lines that actually make up the graph in this case. Each represents one of these two ranges. The big blind is in purple and the UA player is in pink. If the checkboxes on the right are ticked, then you'll see the lines are going to look thicker like this because every combo in the range is actually highlighted. If I untick the two boxes, then we can just see them as thin lines and we're not highlighting any specific combos, or we're not able to kind of mouse over and view each combo by hovering over it. However, what you'll see when you hover here isn't quite what it seems. It might seem like each combo as an individual hand is highlighted on this list, but in fact, what you're seeing is different EV value. And if I illustrate that by hovering over this furthermost left, and if I illustrate that by hovering over this furthermost left node on the big blinds graph here, and if I illustrate that by hovering over the leftmost point on the big blinds graph, you can see there's tons of different combos in there. These are the lowest EV combos in the big blinds range here. This is basically the combos that are 0 EV. And if I went even further into even more detail, we might actually be able to get the combos that are exactly 0 EV. I can't quite find the correct point on the screen to hover over there. We are going to make this graph expandable so that you guys can see this in a bit more detail. But for now, what's important to remember is that each point on the graph represents an EV value, not a specific hand. This is particularly useful to remember if you're trying to get a sense of how different ranges interact with each other, especially on the river, because being able to see which hands in a certain range are 0 EV, what they're doing, what the candidates are, being able to zone in on a player's bluffing candidates is a really valuable thing to use for analysis here. Now, if we switch over to the equity view, like I showed you a second ago, the view is obviously going to shift because no hand has 0 equity on this flop or any other flop. And the equity view of the range graph is a really good way to see how the equity is distributed between the two ranges. If you've used solvers before, you're probably familiar with looking at solver graphs in this way. You're going to see these equity distributions and be able to estimate how many nut hands, middle hands, weak hands, etc. each player is going to have. And identifying which player possesses a range advantage in certain portions of the range is a pretty important skill, and it's going to be very useful for us to cultivate in terms of our ability to break down solver outputs and understand why they look the way they do. Now, one important thing to remember is that the range graph reads in the opposite direction from the range map. So the range map has the highest EV hands on the left and reads from high to low, left to right. The range graph, because it's ordered in percentiles, has the 0 percentile on the left and the 100th percentile on the right. So it does read in the opposite direction. Hopefully that's not too confusing. Eventually you get used to it. Now, the final aspect of the range graph that's important to understand here is to remember that we can drag our bars here and focus on different portions of the range. If we want to focus on just the top portions of both players' ranges, we can either drag one side to maybe the halfway point here, and you can see we're now visualizing the top half of the in-position player's range in terms of EV. If we want to go to maybe the top quarter of the ranges, then it's going to highlight on the graph right here, the top quarter of both players' ranges. It's going to take a moment to load. And then, as you can see, we've got the strongest hands in the in-position player's range and the strategy that they're picking here. This is obviously going to be super useful for breaking down strategies in detail once you get into later streets. There's a lot that you can do here. You can highlight the middle hands, highlight the weak hands, highlight the zero EV hands, all sorts of things you can do to really get a sense of how the strategy is built with different portions of the range. For example, if I drag both sides, I can see, well, what are the hands that are slightly below the top, but not quite weak hands? What are the hands that are strong, but not super strong? So the top pair region here, we've got all of this stuff, Queen 10 through Ace Queen. We can see exactly what those hands are doing now. And of course, the range map also adapts as well, so we can look at specific combos. So that's the range graph for you. Our next port of call is to revisit the Runouts viewer in a little bit more detail. So let's do that now. Now, the Runouts tab is one of my favorite tools when reviewing a spot through Octopi, so let me show you a few ways in which I think it can be really useful. We're going to open up a slightly different flop here. You can see I've got this Queen 10, 8, 2 clubs up there. The reason is because it's a little easier for this explanation to use a situation where there's only one bet size being used on the flop. In this formation, this Queen 10, 8 is actually a range bet for a small size for the U8 player here, so we're just going to go with that. And then we're going to look at what happens after the big blind check calls. So we're going to follow down the check call line, and we're going to pick just a random turn. For the purposes of looking at runouts, it doesn't matter that much which turn you pick. It's just going to come up here in the viewer, and then the runouts button is going to highlight right here. So we're going to focus on 3 primary questions when we're analyzing the runouts viewer here. The first one is we're going to analyze which turn cards, if any, the big blind might want to donk bet after check calling the flop. Secondly, we're going to analyze what the U8 player's turn strategy looks like across all turns once the big blind checks. And finally, we're going to pick a few specific hand combos in the under the gun 8 player's range and see what those exact hands are doing on certain turn cards. That last one's especially helpful since it's pretty common to have players look at a solver output and find themselves saying, well, okay, the solver is telling me I'm supposed to bet this hand on the flop or the turn, but I have no idea what I'm supposed to do when I get to the river if I bet and villain calls. Using the Runouts viewer, you can answer some of these questions. Let's tackle that first question. Which turn cards can the big blind donk bet here, if any? Well, I've navigated through the tree here to the big blind check call line, and if we hit the Show Runouts tab, we can answer the question that we just asked. Doesn't take very long here, and as you can see, we've got a pretty clear conclusion to make, which is that we don't really donk bet the turn at all unless it's specifically an 8, maybe a 10, or the ace of clubs. Now, this is pretty common for situations where the flop bet size is fairly small. The range that calls the flop bet isn't particularly condensed into any one region of hands, which means that there's no specific turn cards that massively impact the check calling range. The 8 is the closest thing to a really good card for the check call range, and even that isn't that great. So that's the answer to our first question. Our second question was about the under the gun 8 player's turn strategies. So let's take a look at that now. If we navigate to this node for the in-position player, we just hit Show Runouts, and we're going to get the strategies right here. Now, this is where it gets a lot more complex because obviously we've got a lot of different strategies across a lot of different turn cards right here. In the top right, you can see the option to switch between the EV and the equity view, but I don't think that's super necessary to do here since the main point of this screen is to analyze the strategies. Now, there are a few ways we could frame out the under the gun 8 player's strategy here, so let me run you through a couple of the viewpoints that I think are most useful. Since this is a 2-tone flop, we can reasonably assume that the suit of the turn card probably matters. So we're going to sort by suits first of all. And then we're going to sort by rank after that, just to make sure everything goes in a nice clean order from ace down to deuce. This immediately presents us with a few conclusions that we can draw. When the turn completes a flush here, unless it's specifically the 10, there's not really any overbetting going on. Whereas when the turn is an offsuit deuce through 5, like a deuce of hearts or a 5 of spades, there's a lot more overbetting. There's quite a bit of overbetting in the in-position strategy right there. Next, we can also sort by rank and then by suit in the inverse way, so we can get a sense of how the rank of the turn card affects the strategy. And right there, you can see any 9, it features quite a lot of small betting, whereas a jack actually features quite a bit of overbetting. That's a big difference that we have to take note of there. The 9 or the jack complete different straights, and that interacts differently for both players. There is a specific reason why the jack is better for under the gun than the 9 is, but I'll leave that up to you guys to try to figure out. Now let's change our sorting method and sort the turns by EV here for the under the gun player. Now, generally, when you sort by EV, the second parameter here doesn't really matter very much because there aren't really going to be many turns where the EV is exactly the same for two different cards. So ultimately, it's not really going to matter which second parameter you choose here when you're sorting by EV first. It's only really going to matter when you're sorting by rank or suit. Now, if we were to actually flip here from the EV to the equity view, we can start to see a bit of a comparison of the differences between the turn cards that have the highest EV for the U8 player and the turn cards that have the highest equity for the U8 player. There is going to be a difference there in a lot of cases, and this is a noteworthy thing to pay attention to. So that's quite an interesting avenue that you can go down and something you can dig into. For example, while the Ace of Clubs is the 4th highest equity card for the under the gun 8 player, if we switch back to EV, it's only the 13th highest EV card for the under the gun 8 player. That might be an interesting one to try to figure out. There's a few reasons, but again, I'll let you figure it out. Now, finally, let's make use of this very useful section at the bottom here, where we can look at individual hand strategies for the under the gun 8 player. We'll switch back to sorting by suit and then by rank, because that's going to make life a little easier. And then we're going to select a hand, let's say pocket queens. We're going to go with red pocket queens here. So queen of hearts, queen of diamonds. In this case, as you can see, we've got a clear perspective of what the turn strategy is for pocket queens. And there's really only one turn card where we do a substantial amount of checking, which is the jack of diamonds. Even when the turn completes a straight, in most cases, we're still going to continue value betting top set. This is giving us a really nice sense of what types of sizings, what types of overall strategies we're going to be using with an individual hand once we arrive at a specific type of spot. So this is a great way to try to understand which turn cards we're going to be value betting with certain combos, for example. If we select a hand like perhaps 10-9 of hearts, let's change that queen of hearts into a 10, and then let's also change that other queen into a 9. And as you can see here, there are some turn cards where we're betting, but there's a lot where we're checking. The ones where we're betting are going to be an interesting example of some merging effects here. We're going to occasionally bet and get better to fold and also get worse to call. There's also some interesting bluffing going on an ace here, which again, we should potentially look into and try to understand in a bit more detail. And then lastly, if we look at something at the very, very bottom of the range, like for example, 5-4 of spades, if we look at that specific hand, then we're going to be able to see which turn cards we're supposed to be bluffing and for what sizes. And the answer is a lot of them. You can really clearly see here that there's quite a lot of potential for this hand to turn into a bluff on the turn. So this is a great way to see if I'm supposed to bet the flop with a certain hand, what am I supposed to do on the turn, and so on. Now note that this does not function the same way as the blockers tab. This is not on an or basis, this is on an and basis. If I was to only highlight one card here, or if I was to look at something like 9-5, which isn't in the under the gun player's range, it just doesn't give me any results. I have to actually select a hand that is in the range in order to get an actual answer here. So that's how the Runouts tab works. It's a great way of getting an understanding of how your strategy frames out across multiple streets and understanding what the incentives of individual hands are as far as they compare to your overall range. Now let's move on to our last point, which is the concept of subranges. Now we touched on subranges a little bit in the first video where you saw me selecting different categories of hands and seeing what they were doing. But this time around, we're going to use the subranges in conjunction with the side-by-side function in order to boost our understanding of why certain strategies look the way they do and from where certain hands are capturing their EV. We're going to go back to our 9-8-5 flop that we just looked at previously. So we're going to go 9 of hearts, 8 of diamonds, 5 of diamonds. Oops. We're going to go back to our 9-8-5 flop that we previously looked at. So I'm just going to bring it up right there. And we're going to focus on the flop node here for the time being, where big blind checks and we're looking at the U8 player deciding to bet the 75% size or check. We're going to open up the side-by-side mode and look at how the big blind responds against this B75 size. Now, when we look at this, keep an eye on the boxes below the main strategy dashboard right here. You can see that there are exactly 16 of these boxes in a 4x4 grid on each side, and that's not a coincidence. Even though some are going to be grayed out in this specific spot, depending on which hands are available on a given board, there are reasons why there's exactly 16 of these boxes. You'll notice that the 4 rows of boxes here are arranged in order of hand strength, with the top 3 rows being occupied by made hands and the bottom row occupied by draws. Comparing each of these rows between the two players is a great way of understanding the interactions between the two ranges and how each player is approaching the spot. Let's start with the top row here. The big blind on the left has a straight 3% of the time and a set 2% of the time, while the under the gun 8 player has a straight 1% of the time and a set 5% of the time. If we add up those frequencies, we can ascertain that neither player has a substantial advantage in the strongest categories of hands here. It's 5% versus 6%. If we move to the second row, we've got the medium strength 1-pair hands, and adding up the percentages here gives us 29% for the big blind and 27% for the U8 player. So once again, it's pretty close together, with the exception that half of the U8 player's hands in this category are overpairs, while the big blind has a lot of top pair and second pair instead. On the third row, you see the weaker portion of the range, the third pair, low pair, ace high, and king high. And the U8 player on the right here has a lot more hands in this category, with the ace high region being more than a third of their overall range. This is a clue as to why the U8 player doesn't get to play super aggressively here. They simply have a lot of medium to weak ace high hands in their range. Finally, we have the draws, and while it's tempting to focus on the flush draw, the important thing is to note that neither player really has a flush draw here very often. The big blind only has one 5% of the time with 4% combo draws, and the U8 player has 7% flush draws and 3% combo draws. So in the end, neither player has a flush draw any more than about 10% of the time here. And that's going to be very consistent across a lot of different scenarios. Now, one thing I really like to do here is to focus in on some of the hand regions in the in-position player's range. One thing I really like to do here is to focus in on certain hands in the in-position player's range where it's not really super clear exactly why they're betting this flop, and then try to use the subranges to establish where the EV of that bet is actually coming from. If we pick a hand in the under the gun 8 player's range that isn't an obvious betting candidate, like say red pocket sevens here, then we can hone in on certain things to figure out where the EV of that bet is coming from. Firstly, is it getting called by worse? We can highlight the pocket sevens on the right-hand side here, and then highlight all the worst made hands over on the left-hand side. So we will highlight third pair, we will highlight low pair, we will highlight ace high, king high. Not going to worry too much about the draws, but generally you can quite clearly see here that there's at least some hands containing a 5 that are calling, pocket 6 is calling a decent amount, and there's also some dominated stuff in there. There's going to be some ace 7, king 7 type hands. So generally, a hand like pocket sevens does get at least some EV from that. That hand does achieve a fairly significant benefit from getting action from those worse hands. And the next thing would be, is it getting better hands to fold? If we want to analyze that, we can now unselect all of these hands and instead select the categories of hands directly above pocket sevens, second pair and top pair. And in fact, it is true that pocket sevens is getting some better hands to fold. You can see that an 8 is folding sometimes. A 9 is folding a fair amount, a weak 9, 9-4, that type of stuff. A decently strong 8 with no diamonds, king 8 and ace 8, those hands are folding as well. So in fact, pocket sevens is achieving both at once here. It's able to get better to fold and get worse to call. So it's achieving some merging effects in this case. Merging effects exist a lot on draw-heavy boards where bluff catchers might fold but draws will continue. And they're a good thing to watch out for because they can help us to explain why certain hands make sense to bet even in situations where they're actually quite middle strength. There are, of course, other ways that we can use the subranges as well. We can use it to get better clarity over different portions of the range in the range map. or to simply examine the strategies for different portions of the ranges in more detail, as I showed you in the first video. If we jump back to the main strategy dashboard here, at the node where the big blind responds to the bet, one thing you can do here is to click on a specific action. So in this case, it's going to be the raise, and it's going to highlight all the hands that take that action at any frequency, which is going to be a really interesting way to get a sense of what this overall sub-range for that action actually looks like. You can see here, the hands that are raising here, they're only doing it about 29% of the time. So it's not like there are very specific hands that are always raising and a lot of hands that are never raising. There's quite a lot of mixing going on. However, make sure you note that when you click a specific option, just because the combo lights up on the strategy dashboard, it doesn't mean that all combos of that hand are included within that specific sub-range. For example, if I hover over ace 10 suited here, it's only ace 10 of diamonds that's selected here because that's the only combination of ace 10 that's in the sub-range. And within that individual combo, it's now raising 80% of the time and calling 20% of the time. So this block that you see filled in here is basically only representing ace 10 suited. It's not representing all the combos of ace 10. That's about it for the sub-ranges. I would encourage you to play around with these tools and get accustomed to them and find new ways to use them yourself that work well for the way that your brain perceives poker. It's always important to analyze hands and get curious about spots in a variety of different ways. And solvers are a great tool for exploring and figuring out what works for you and what makes things more intelligible for you to understand. So that brings us to the end of our advanced guide to the Octopi Poker post-flop library. Thanks for sticking with me this far. I hope you've gotten a lot of good tips from these videos and that you feel confident using the post-flop strategy viewer to explore situations and help to further your understanding of the post-flop principles of how No Limit Hold'em works. We're going to be putting out plenty of content on the site in future using the post-flop library, so make sure you look out for new videos on our YouTube channel and on the site itself. Best of luck, everyone, with your studying and at the tables. Thanks.